Welcome, wee ones, to Scottish Murders. Dawn will shortly be taking you through a solved or unsolved murder involving people from or living in Scotland. So get ready to hear about the darker side of bonnie Scotland.
This is part 2 of Stuart Gair's story. I'm going to pick up after Stuart had been convicted of Peter Smith's murder and had been sent to prison to begin his sentence. Stuart refused to accept his conviction, refused to lie down and accept what had happened to him, refused to bend to a life in prison, and so he spent a lot of his time in solitary confinement. However, he did make one friend, a vital friend in fact, a Dr. Jim McGregor. Dr. Jim McGregor was a GP who worked part-time as a medical officer at the prison Stuart was at. Stuart would tell Dr. McGregor about how he was in prison for a murder he didn't commit, and Stuart would repeat this time and time again until Dr. McGregor became curious and wondered if perhaps what Stuart was saying was correct. And so Dr. McGregor got access to the court documents in Stuart's trial and began studying them and asking Stuart question after question, until eventually Dr. McGregor concluded that there had been a miscarriage of justice, and he was determined to get Stuart's conviction overturned. Knowing he wouldn't be able to do this alone, Dr. McGregor organised a campaign to bring more awareness to Stuart's case and hopefully attract people that could help Stuart in his plight. And it did just that. Stuart's case attracted a lot of public attention, including that of Scottish actor and director Peter Mullen, Glasgow solicitor John Macaulay, who became Stuart's solicitor from 1995, Bernard Ponsonby, who was a Scottish broadcast journalist working for Scottish TV, STV, Neil Mackay, who was an editor at The Big Issue, which is a street newspaper, and award-winning journalist Eamon O'Neill, all of whom, once they had investigated Stuart's case, came to the same conclusion. Stuart was innocent and had been fitted up. In 1994 and 1998, STV broadcast 2 documentaries, where, according to an article in the STV News by Bernard Ponsonby on the 6th of October 2020, 3 key Crown witnesses admitted on camera that they had given perjured evidence, all claiming that they had been blackmailed by the police to do this, with the threat being that the police would reveal that they were homosexual if they didn't incriminate Stuart Gair. Bernard went on to say that in these documentaries, 2 alibi witnesses for Stuart Gair, who did not give evidence in court, said that they were watching TV at the bed and breakfast with Stuart at the time the murder had taken place. So why didn't the jury hear from them? Why were they not put on the stand? Was Stuart's solicitor at the trial that incompetent? The documentaries went on to establish that despite the brutal murder of Peter, which would have included blood splattering being on the murderer, no forensics could link Stuart to the crime. Nothing. As for Brian Morrison's changing testimonies and the fact that once he had been charged with perjury and threatened with 7 years in prison if he did not stick to the original story, the untruth, Bernard said in the same article that this amounted, in his view, to the Crown extorting evidence. It also mentioned how the prosecution had deliberately concealed evidence that could help Stuart Gair by not disclosing to the defence that Brian Morrison had said that a lot of what he had told the police was not true, and that he had said these things to attract attention to himself, as well as the note that had been attached to the prosecution trial papers, which said that Brian Morrison and his vivid imagination certainly set the police off on the trail of a red herring initially, which Bernard thought was vital that the defence should have known about this, as it gave an insight into the mental state of a key witness. The STV documentaries and Bernard concluded that Stuart had been found guilty of a crime he did not commit due to a mix of corruption and incompetence. Bernard felt so strongly that Stuart had suffered a miscarriage of justice that he took the findings to Graham Bell, who was the leading advocate when it came to criminal appeals. However, Bernard was shocked when Graham told him that regardless of the information Bernard had presented to him, in order to have a murder conviction quashed, new evidence was needed, new evidence that hadn't been available at the time of the trial, and as of such quality that no reasonable jury would have convicted. Graham went on to shock Bernard further when he stated that regardless of the 3 witnesses who had stated on camera for the STV documentaries that they had been lying on the stand, this would not be classed as new evidence, as the witnesses had appeared at the trial, had been able to tell the truth, but they chose not to tell it. Therefore, that was not new evidence. Again, regarding Stuart's alibi witnesses who weren't called at the trial, Graham reiterated that Stuart's witnesses had been on the defence witness list, but they hadn't been called, and therefore again this was not new evidence, as they could have given their evidence at the time of the trial if they had been called. Bernard was shocked by what Graham Bell had told him. How could this be right? If this was the case, then how on earth could poor Stuart ever hope to have his wrongful conviction quashed? The criteria on having a possible miscarriage of justice case referred for review was far too high, ridiculously high. So where did this leave Stuart? It left him stuck in prison, unwilling to accept his sentence, and unwilling to conform to prison life, even though there appeared no hope of getting his conviction quashed. It left Stuart to slowly slip into despair. Stuart's solicitor, John Macaulay, was also working hard to discover new evidence that could help Stuart. Since taking over as Stuart's solicitor in 1995, John Macaulay had uncovered one impropriety after another, according to the Guardian newspaper on the 13th of November 2007. He too had been in contact with key witnesses at the trial who had also retracted their evidence. He had sought the help of leading consultant pathologists Dr. Bill Hunt and Professor Bernard Knight, who, after looking at the forensic evidence presented at the trial, described it as ranging from quite seriously flawed to total nonsense, as well as commenting that the knife produced in the original trial could not have been the murder weapon. But again, with the criteria for a case to be considered for review for appeal being so high, regardless of evidence or witness testimonies collected, without what was seen as new evidence, nothing could be done to get Stuart's case sent for appeal. Which is why in Scotland it had been quite a rare thing for a murder conviction to have been quashed. That was until April 1999, when the brand new Scottish Criminal Case Review Commission was established, which had a more tolerant outlook on the criteria needed for cases to be referred for appeal, and Stuart's was the first case that was referred to the Scottish Criminal Cases Review Commission, or the SCCRC, seeking an appeal. After reviewing Stuart's case, the SCCRC established that the new evidence presented warranted the case being sent to the appeal court for them to make a decision on the evidence provided. And so, after being arrested for a murder he hadn't committed, after going through a stressful and farcical trial for the said murder, after being found guilty and sentenced to life, after being determined not to accept his conviction or conform to prison life, after spending 11 years in prison for a murder he did not commit, and having to face the prospect of never having his sentence quashed, on the 29th of September 2000, Stuart Gair was released on bail, pending the outcome of the appeal. Stuart was free. He was out. He should be celebrating. He should be over the moon. But Stuart Gair was a changed man, and in all the wrong ways. The years he had spent in prison as an innocent man had damaged him, mentally and physically. In prison, while he knew he was innocent, he was still there. He'd still had his life snatched away from him, and he had to find a way to cope with that on a day-to-day basis, and so he had turned to drugs. While Stuart had dabbled in drugs when he was on the outside, in prison he turned to heroin, to forget, to cope, to get by. So while Stuart should have been celebrating, should have been happy, all he could think about was his next fix. All he could think about was that now he didn't even have the routine of prison to anchor him. While Stuart had an army of supporters and campaigners, while he was in prison, he had lost touch with his friends and family. And so here he was now, on the outside, where he dreamed of being, with no one and nothing. No job, no money, no roof over his head, alone. The authorities that had so cruelly convicted Stuart of being a murderer and had taken away his liberty and destroyed him had once again let this man down. They had thrown him out on the street with absolutely nothing. If he were an actual murderer, he would have been treated so much better. He would have been supported. He would have been set up in a job. He would have had day releases to get him used to the real world again. He would have been given a roof over his head. So why treat miscarriages of justice victims so poorly? Haven't they been treated unfairly enough? Why did Stuart not deserve support from the very authorities that had sought to ruin him? Stuart himself said, after being out in the real world for a while, that his life was nothing, and he would have been better off being in prison. Is that right? Is that how people who have been treated appallingly by the authorities should be treated, should be feeling? One man who stood by Stuart, though, was Dr. Jim McGregor, who had campaigned hard for Stuart and had even had to give up his job in the prison due to animosity towards him for helping Stuart. Dr. McGregor invited Stuart to live with him, his wife and his children for a while until he got sorted out, and Stuart gladly accepted. However, sadly, the roof over his head and his friendship with Dr. McGregor didn't last long, as Dr. McGregor had to ask Stuart to leave when his young children had come across Stuart taking heroin. So once again, Stuart was on his own, with nothing, not even a roof over his head. Stuart returned to prison periodically on charges of possessing heroin and for breach of the peace. Each time on being released, Stuart would aimlessly walk through life again, with no purpose, no support, and he would regularly find himself having to live on the streets of Glasgow. It didn't help that Stuart was also stuck in limbo while he waited for the appeal courts to make their decision. All Stuart had structure-wise in his life now was that he would have to regularly attend the Court of Appeal in Edinburgh, where witnesses made new statements and were questioned, and where new evidence was put forward, all while the Court of Appeal tried to determine if Stuart was a victim of a miscarriage of justice. And this whole process went on for 6 years. Was it any wonder Stuart was stuck in limbo, between being on the outside and the threat of going back inside if his appeal was refused? How could Stuart make any plans, make any friendships, have any relationships with that threat constantly hanging over him? Stuart was a lost man. Throughout the 6 grueling years, the Court of Appeal heard from William MacLeod, Brian Morrison, Alan Gillan and Hector Wood, and made the decision whether this evidence was significant, and whether, by the jury not knowing this alternative evidence or testimonies, if it could have led them to instead finding Stuart Gair not guilty. In William MacLeod's new evidence, he said that when speaking at the murder trial, he had made up the story of knowing Stuart and seeing him stab Peter just so the police would leave him alone and not tell his family and friends that he was gay, as they had apparently threatened to do. But William said that the police had fed him all the information and that he had just made up a story. William MacLeod told the Court of Appeal that he had changed his story while at the original trial so many times because, silly as it may sound, I didn't know what the truth and what the lies were by this point. He also said that he had panicked when he had been threatened with perjury and that he could be looking at 8 to 10 years. He said he had also been warned by detectives that he had better stick to the original story, and he was scared that if he didn't, they would make his life hell. He also admitted at the Court of Appeal that there had never been any threats towards him while he was in prison. That was lies, and he didn't know why he said that. William also said at the Court of Appeal that he had told his solicitor that he didn't know Stuart and that he had been treated badly by police officers, and that his solicitor had told him to tell the truth and get it over and done with, to which he said he went into the murder trial and told lies. Williams said that he had suffered depression and anxiety attacks in his life after the trial and that he had had to give up his job. The Court of Appeal also heard Brian Morrison's testimony. At the original murder trial, Brian had said that he had seen 2 men running away from the area where Peter had been found stabbed, and that he had got a good look at the men. However, at the identification parades, he had not been able to pick out Stuart or William, but at the actual trial, he was able to pick out Stuart and William as being the men he had seen. At the Court of Appeal, he said that he had not actually seen anything. He said that the details in his statement, which had said that he had seen 2 men and had been threatened by one of them, he had made up from listening to what other witnesses and police were saying that night, going on to say that the police had even given him a tour of the crime scene. He also said that he had been picked up every few days by a DC Harries on the run-up to the trial, and that DC Harries would feed him more information and tell him what to say, as well as being threatened that he would be exposed to his friends and family of being gay. He said he had also been told where Stuart and William had been sitting in the courtroom so that he was able to pick them out, and that he'd also been shown a photograph of Stuart, although he did say in an affidavit that it had actually been a fluke that he had picked out William in court. He also said that he had been threatened by numerous people on the run-up to testifying in the Court of Appeal. The Court of Appeal was reminded, though, that Brian Morrison was an attention seeker and that he was seeking compensation for his alleged ill treatment by the police. Brian was therefore seen as an unimpressive and unstable witness. Alan Gillen also gave evidence in the Court of Appeal. Alan had been sitting in his car near St Vincent Place when he had seen two men running away from the area, and he picked out Stuart Gair at the identification parade as well as at the murder trial. At the Court of Appeal, Alan didn't mention seeing two men running away, but instead mentioned seeing a man walking in the alley, but thought that he had seen a bundle lying on the ground in the dingy alley, before he then drove away in his car. He came forward to police the following day when he heard about the stabbing. At the police station, he was shown a selection of photographs, but he couldn't pick anyone out, going on to say that this was the point that DC Harries pointed to a picture of Stuart and said, "That's the one." Alan said he had been brought up to agree with the police, and so accepted that this was true. He went on to say that at the identification parade where he picked out Stuart, he said he picked Stuart because he had a strong resemblance to the man in the photograph he had been shown, but that other than in the photograph, he had never seen Stuart before. Alan said he had returned the next day to the police station and had told DC Harries and his colleague that it was not Stuart that he had seen in the alley, and that Stuart only resembled him in height and hair colour. However, he said that DC Harries told him that he couldn't change his statement, and that if he said he hadn't recognised the man he saw as being Stuart, then DC Harries would tell Alan's parents and possibly his employers that he was gay. Alan said this threat worried him, as he was gay, but not openly. He went on to say that he believed DC Harries had told him where Stuart was sitting in court so he could pick him out easily. When Alan was asked why he had never said anything prior to making a statement for the Court of Appeal, he said that he had only come forward after he had found out that other witnesses at the murder trial had retracted their statements and said that they had suffered similar threats by the police. Realising that he wouldn't be alone in speaking out gave him courage to retract his statement, although he did admit that he didn't want to be the only witness left that had identified Stuart Gair as the murderer of Peter Smith. William MacLeod, Brian Morrison and Alan Gillen were all described in the Court of Appeal as vulnerable and weak, who would not easily be able to stand up to the police under threats, and it was stated that none of these men had reason to now perjure themselves. Then it was Hector Wood's turn to finally get to give his witness statement that supported Stuart Gair's account of his whereabouts at the time of the murder, having not been called in the original murder trial. Hector's statement said that Stuart could not have been in the alley at St Vincent Place at the time of Peter's murder, as he was with him in the bed and breakfast where they both lived. Hector stated that he had given his witness statement to DC Harries and another police officer, and that DC Harries had repeatedly asked him if he was gay. Hector stated that he was told if he were to change his statement to say that he wasn't with Stuart at the time, then he could have an outstanding fine wiped clean. Hector said he had felt intimidated. However, Hector was neither vulnerable or weak and was in employment at the time as an acoustics engineer and had refused to cooperate. He then said he was arrested regarding his outstanding fine, and DC Harries was there for that. Hector assumed DC Harries was behind that, and this was his way of punishing Hector for not cooperating. However, it was reported that apparently Hector had not provided Stuart with an alibi for the relevant time in his original statement. Hector was also accused of having previous convictions for dishonesty, which he denied. PC Shirley Marnock's statement was also brought into question at the appeal. PC Marnock reported at the time that she had seen two men acting suspiciously near the area where Peter had been stabbed. PC Marnock had stated that the men she had seen were 5'8" or 1.72 metres and 5'10" inches, about 1.77 metres respectively. However, when it came to the identification parade, she picked out Stuart Gair and William MacLeod, both being over 6 feet or 1.82 metres in height, as being the men she had seen near where the crime had taken place. Due to the marked difference in PC Marnock's original accounts, it was stated that neither Stuart or William could possibly have been either of the men she had seen, but subsequently picked out as such at the identity parade. At the Court of Appeal, the former PC Shirley Marnock had very little recollection of events, relying heavily on documents and her statements from the time. However, she admitted finding nothing remarkable in the discrepancies between the height of the men she had seen on the night of the murder and the height of both Stuart and William MacLeod, who she had later picked out of a lineup. However, this discrepancy was not disclosed at the murder trial, deeming it new evidence. If this discrepancy had been made available at the trial, it may just have brought into question PC Marnock's identification of Stuart and William as being the men she had seen that night. Although PC Marnock was able to produce an e-fit of one of the men she had seen that night, which was similar to that of William MacLeod, which William himself admitted at the time. And that was it. David Smith could not be found, and Stuart Gair's girlfriend at the time of the murder had died, and so had PC Lewis Fulton, who had been with PC Shirley Marnock on the fatal night Peter had been stabbed, and had also identified William MacLeod at the identity parade. Following all of this evidence being presented to the appeal judges had to make their decision, which they did on the 7th of June 2005. The judges rejected these grounds of appeal, deeming that regardless if this evidence had been heard at the original trial, it would not have affected the outcome of Stuart being found guilty. This verdict was devastating and deflating for everyone involved, especially Stuart, who was still stuck in limbo with no definite answer to whether he would be allowed to stay on the outside or be thrown back into prison. However, there was still another chance for Stuart's conviction to be quashed, as another court of appeal was due to take place the following year regarding the remaining grounds of Stuart's appeal. While we can only imagine how Stuart must have felt upon leaving the Court of Appeal following the first part of his appeal being rejected, in an article in the Herald newspaper in November 2005, 5 months after the rejection verdict, we got a wee glimpse into just how the last 16 years of Stuart either being in prison for a crime he did not commit or being stuck in limbo with nothing and nobody had really affected him, and it didn't look good. I went to bed a few nights ago and, to be honest, if I'd had the bottle, I wouldn't have woken up the next day. I'm completely lost," said Stuart to the reporter of the newspaper when he was asked how he was doing. Despite Stuart being only 42, he had gone from having boyish looks to having a thin, lined face, a weather-beaten thin body with an unsteady, hunching, shuffling gait, faltering speech, and a fixed, sleepy-eyed stare. Stuart had finally got a drug worker who had supported him to come off heroin, and he was now a methadone user, although he was reducing this also week by week. His drug worker had also, after a long fight, been able to get Stuart a temporary furnished flat. However, this had taken a long time, as the government wasn't keen to give Stuart a flat as he was out on bail for a murder conviction. Stuart went on to say that he still couldn't get any work due to this, and that nobody wrote back to him when he applied for work, saying that he would take anything. He still had very little money, living only on the meagre benefit money he received, and said that he'd still been unable to have a proper relationship of any kind, going on to say that, "I know this sounds a bit pathetic, but I haven't had anyone give me a hug or a cuddle in years. No one cares. It's been hellish." And Stuart's eyes started to redden and his voice cracked. When Stuart was asked what his life was like now, he said it was schizophrenic, before changing his mind and saying that actually he didn't have a life. He got up in the morning, went to the chemist for his methadone, went to the Salvation Army for a meal as it was the only place he could afford, then he walked back to his flat where he barricaded himself in and sat alone watching talk shows until the next morning when he woke up and did it all again. He said he lived day to day, hour to hour, having absolutely no purpose in life. All he could think about was the appeal, how it was still hanging over him, and the awful thought of being thrown back in prison, which is what Stuart was sure was going to happen, saying that he was in a desperate state of mind about the appeal. The verdict of the appeal that Stuart had been both dreading and waiting for 6 long years to happen, the verdict that would either see him have his wrongful conviction for murder 17 years prior be deemed a miscarriage of justice and quashed, and finally set him free, or where he would be thrown back in prison for a crime he did not commit, was delivered by the Court of Appeal in July 2006. But before we get to the verdict, let's go through the new evidence that was delivered to the judges at the Court of Appeal in July 2006 that ultimately led to the judges deciding on their verdict. There were 3 appeal points put to the Court of Appeal that were believed to have led to a miscarriage of justice. One being the fact that the Crown had William arrested and charged for perjury as he had changed his testimony on the stand and had not incriminated Stuart as had been expected, but then the Crown had decided to drop the charge and take no further action upon William MacLeod taking to the witness box again and this time incriminating Stuart Gair in Peter's murder. This was said to amount to an inducement to William to change his evidence. The second point was that Stuart's representation had been defective due to his special defence alibi not being properly presented in court, as Hector Wood was not called, as well as a failure to properly examine medical and scientific evidence. And the third point, the point that was the main focus, was that the Crown had failed to disclose material evidence to the defence prior to the trial, such as previous statements that had been given to the police by Alan Gillan, Brian Morrison and PC Shirley Marnock, that were at odds with evidence that these witnesses had given at the trial, as well as the information that had been withheld regarding Brian Morrison's statement to the police where he said that a lot of what he had told the police was not true, as well as the comment that he had a vivid imagination and had set the police off on the trail of a red herring. It was believed that if all of this information had been disclosed at the trial, it would have cast serious doubt on the Crown's case against Stuart. Stuart's counsel began by stating that as William MacLeod had been, as the trial judge had said, an appalling witness, due to his testimony changing so much on the stand, it was imperative that his statement be backed up in order to give his testimony any credibility, which it had been by 5 witnesses: David Smith, PC Lewis Fulton and PC Shirley Marnock, Alan Gillan and Brian Morrison. As these witnesses' testimonies were vital in backing up what the appalling witness William MacLeod had said on the stand, it was also vital that any previous statements that they had made to the police were disclosed in order to not only give a fuller picture to the jury, but also to give Stuart's defence counsel a chance to defend Stuart by countering what was being said on the stand with previous statements. And the issue was that no previous statements had been disclosed by the Crown to Stuart's defence team. As David Smith had disappeared and could not be traced, and PC Fulton was deceased, the focus would be on Alan Gillan, PC Shirley Marnock, and Brian Morrison's previous statements. When Alan Gillan and Shirley Marnock's previous statements to the police that hadn't been disclosed to the defence team before the murder trial were investigated, it was determined by the 3 appeal judges that despite these statements not being disclosed to the defence, as there was very little difference in the statements, they deemed that these statements would not have altered the outcome of the trial, and therefore these points were rejected. That just left Brian Morrison's statements to be investigated. Brian had been in the vicinity of where Peter was stabbed between 11 and 11:30 p.m. that evening. He said he had seen 2 men running away from the area and that he had been threatened by one of them, and he had identified the men as being Stuart Gair and William MacLeod. Brian had not been able to pick out Stuart at the identification parade, but instead a stand-in. However, at the murder trial, he had been able to point out Stuart in court. Brian had been cross-examined and questioned as to how he could be so sure it had been Stuart that he had seen running away from the area that night. Brian had replied that he had got a good look at the men and was in no doubt, but he had no answer as to why he had been unable to pick out Stuart at the identification parade. The defence had no knowledge of the other police statements Brian had made, again believing that if they had been made aware of these statements by the Crown, then this could have changed the outcome of the murder trial. Brian Morrison had actually made 4 separate statements to the police that had never been disclosed to the defence before the murder trial. His first statement was given in the early hours of the 12th of April, an hour or so after Peter had been found with a stab wound, and much of the statement was believed to have been some kind of fantasy. It said that Brian was a male nurse, but said that he was also homeless, and that he'd seen 2 young men who'd ran out of the lane and shouted at him, "Morrison, if anything happens or if you see anything going on, don't open your mouth or else you're going to die." He then said he was pushed to the ground and told to go away before the men ran back into the lane. Brian described the 2 men as being 5 foot 10 inches or 1.77 metres tall. He said that he definitely knew the man who had mentioned his name, but he couldn't remember where from. However, he then remembered that this man might have been called Ian, before confirming that he would definitely be able to identify the 2 men again. However, about 3 p.m. on the 12th of April, Brian gave a second statement to the police. This time he told them just how he knew Ian, and that Ian was one of the 2 men who he had seen near the area of the crime the previous evening. Brian then gave a third statement to the police on the 21st of April 1989, where he said that much of what he had said to the police was not the truth, and he had made some of it up to attract attention to himself. He apologised for the trouble he had caused, but said he couldn't carry on pretending he had seen things when he hadn't. He said he had done things like this before to attract attention to himself, and that once he starts, he can't stop. He then said that he had been in town that night, that he had heard a shout in the lane, that he had seen 2 men, but that neither of them had threatened him or said his name. Apparently, he came up with the name Ian, as this had been someone who had been causing him bother. He had then picked this Ian out of photographs shown to him. He said he picked the stand-in out in the identity parade because he thought he had known him, but now he wasn't sure. Brian then made his 4th statement to the police, this time under caution, on the 2nd of June 1989, but this statement was not available. It was explained by the defence that if these statements had been made available at the time of the murder trial, then they could have been used to paint a very different picture of Brian Morrison, the prosecution's key witness, instead of the one that had been painted of him as a reliable male nurse who could be trusted. Then the fact that a note which gave an insight into Brian's mental state at the time of the trial had also not been disclosed to the defence, which again was seen as imperative as to bring into question the validity of the testimony Brian Morrison had made. The wording of the note, which had been given to a member of staff at the court by medical staff at a psychiatric hospital where Brian had signed himself in briefly, when the hospital staff member had phoned the court member to let them know that Brian had signed himself out of the hospital, said that Brian is basically inadequate, has personality problems, and has attempted to take his own life on a number of occasions in the past, and that he and his vivid imagination had certainly set the police off on the trail of a red herring initially. In reply to this, the agent for the Crown stated that, while it was accepted that the statements made by Brian should have been disclosed, it was also believed that no miscarriage of justice had resulted from failure to do so, explaining that there was still a clear body of evidence that pointed to the accuracy of Brian's evidence about seeing Stuart in the area at the time of Peter being stabbed, and that not everything in Brian's statement was fantasy, going on to explain that Ian was in fact a real person that Brian actually knew. In relation to the note from the psychiatric hospital, the agent for the Crown said that Brian had not been in the hospital long enough for an extensive examination to have taken place, and that the member of staff who had taken the message was not an expert who could comment on Morrison's personality or on his psychiatric condition. The agent for the Crown went on to say that even if Brian's evidence had been completely discounted, there still was ample evidence to conclude that no miscarriage of justice had resulted from the defence not having these 4 police statements. With both the defence and agent for the Crown having said their piece, it was now the turn of the judges to make their decision. Would they deem that Stuart had been a victim of a miscarriage of justice due to these statements not being disclosed, or would they continue to agree with the Crown that no miscarriage of justice had taken place? The judges agreed that Brian had been presented at the murder trial as a respectable male nurse with nothing to suggest that he was anything other than a straightforward eyewitness, doing his best to give credible, reliable evidence, and certainly nothing to indicate that he had given inconsistent statements to the police. Going on to say that in the defence's closing statement at the murder trial, they had only been able to remind the jury that Brian Morrison had not been able to pick out Stuart at the identification parade, and warn the jury about the reliability of eyewitness identification in the particular circumstances, before saying that in their opinion all 4 of Brian Morrison's police statements should have been disclosed to the defence, as well as the fact that Brian had signed himself into a psychiatric hospital briefly. And in their minds they had no doubts that the defence would have used this information to paint a different picture of Brian Morrison and completely destroy his testimony. However, the judges went on to say that even if the jury had had the fuller picture of Brian Morrison, they may still have convicted Stuart. There was no way to say for sure. Brian was not an essential witness, but he was an important one. However, the possibility that the jury may have come to a different verdict had the police statements and other information about Brian been disclosed was, in their view, real and certainly could not be excluded. And then the judges were ready to give their decision. After Stuart had served 11 years in prison for a crime he did not commit, after waiting a further 6 years to hear the decision by the appeal judges, Stuart realised he was holding his breath, waiting for what the judges had to say. And then, on the 11th of July 2006, they said the words Stuart had longed to hear, as Judge Lord Abernathy delivered the 3 appeal judges' decision. In these circumstances, we have come to the conclusion that the non-disclosure of these police statements and other information resulted in a miscarriage of justice. As Stuart finally let out a breath and everyone in the courtroom around him was showing their absolute delight, the judges continued by saying that this was sufficient to dispose of the case and that they didn't need to hear the other appeal points that had been raised, before stating that they were allowing the appeal and quashing his conviction. Stuart could not believe it. He finally was really and truly free. His conviction had been quashed and nothing was hanging over him anymore. He could finally start to live his life again. Now, while this was absolutely fantastic news for Stuart Gair, and news he really deserved, what about Peter Smith, who had been murdered, and what about his family? How did they feel about Stuart's conviction being quashed? Well, as it turns out, Peter's family had come to believe that Stuart was innocent too. And when Stuart had been released on bail in September 2000, Peter's sister had said in an article in the Guardian newspaper that she was glad to see Stuart go free, but that she was angry that her brother Peter had not received justice, going on to say that, hopefully, the truth will come out. The trial was a farce, it was a disgrace, and people have the right to know the truth. Sadly, though, Peter's murderer has never been brought to justice, due to incompetence and possibly corruption, and the police being absolutely desperate to pin Peter's murder on Stuart Gair. Not only did an innocent man go to prison for 11 years for a crime he did not commit, not to mention the torture that he went through in the 6 years before his conviction was finally quashed, but also 45-year-old, worldly wise, well-travelled and well-loved Peter Smith had been murdered, and his murderer never caught, or even looked for, it appears. And of course his family were left behind, never knowing who had taken their beloved Peter from them so cruelly. They were left with no answers, just anger at what had happened. There was absolutely no justice for anybody involved in this case, and worse still, nobody has been held accountable for this atrocity. So, what had happened to Stuart? Well, it's been a good day. Things are finally going my way, thought Stuart on Friday, the 26th of October 2007, as he made his way home after enjoying a long hill walk, something he'd taken up in recent months, which he was thoroughly enjoying, and it had also given him a great appetite, so Stuart was once again enjoying eating a variety of food and looking after himself. In the 15 months following his conviction finally being quashed after 11 years in prison and waiting for the outcome of his appeal for a further 6 long years, Stuart had finally been able to find a purpose in life again, a love for life again. He had been able to reduce and completely come off his methadone. He had got himself a nice wee flat in Edinburgh, which he was beginning to see as his home, and he had taken up hill walking and swimming, which was doing wonders for his body. And he finally got that cuddle he had been craving when he got himself a girlfriend, who he was in love with. He had also recently found out that he would be receiving compensation from the government after his miscarriage of justice at the hands of the authorities. He had been told it would be in the region of about £1 million, or £1.3 million and $1.5 million in today's money, and he was told he could expect to receive this within the week. Stuart and his girlfriend had already made plans for what they would do with some of his compensation money. Stuart had always wanted to travel, to see the world, and so he and his girlfriend had planned to start that straight away. Aye, things are really looking bright for me. I'm finally able to live and enjoy my life. I'm quite happy. Oh, what's that pain? That can't be good, cried Stuart as he felt shooting pains in his arm and chest. Thankfully, Stuart was close to his flat, so he made his way there where he could have a wee sit down, thinking maybe he had overdone it with the walking that day. But as Stuart entered his flat, the pains had not receded, and so he sensibly called for an ambulance. The ambulance crew who received the call to attend a male's flat in Edinburgh who was suffering chest pains were being accompanied that day by a film crew and Donald McIntyre, who is an Irish investigative journalist and, according to Wikipedia, specialises in investigations, undercover operations and television exposés. And so when the ambulance crew arrived at Stuart's flat, Stuart was happily surprised to see Donald there too. And so Stuart took the opportunity to speak to Donald and tell him that he'd suffered a miscarriage of justice, and how his conviction had eventually been quashed just the year before, while the paramedics assessed Stuart. While Donald had not been expecting to hear such a story, he was delighted to sit with Stuart and hear about his struggles and ultimate victory and success story. However, after about 20 minutes, suddenly Stuart was no longer able to speak, as his chest pains had returned and he had a massive heart attack. The paramedics sprung into action before rushing him to the hospital, accompanied by Donald McIntyre, who felt a kind of connection to Stuart Gair after hearing about his miscarriage of justice and his long battle to have his conviction quashed. Within half an hour of arriving at the hospital, Stuart had suffered another major heart attack and had lapsed into a coma. 3 days later, Donald McIntyre was contacted by the hospital telling him that Stuart was still in a coma and that there was no hope of recovery, and they were seeking Donald's permission to turn off Stuart's life support, as no family or friends could be found. But Donald couldn't have that. He couldn't be another person to let this man down. And so he remembered that Stuart had mentioned Paddy Hill, who had founded the Miscarriage of Justice organisation in Scotland, along with John McManus, and that Paddy and Mojo had not only supported Stuart with his battle for justice, but also had been a massive support in helping him get back on his feet. And so Donald contacted Paddy at Mojo and told him what had happened to Stuart. On Monday, the 29th of October 2007, at 12:50 p.m, Paddy Hill and John McManus stood at Stuart's hospital bedside as his friends to say goodbye to this man who had suffered such an atrocious injustice, before Stuart's life support was turned off. Stuart died aged 44 years old, and just as he was turning his life around, a life that had been taken away from him 17 years prior. As Stuart's few friends, his girlfriend, who had been visiting her mother for a few days and had no idea about Stuart's heart attack, only having returned to his flat the day after his life support had been turned off, to be told she was too late and that he was gone, and Stuart's supporters stood at his funeral, many probably having the same thoughts. A man taken too soon, a man who had suffered so much stress and anxiety in his life, a man who had been treated so poorly, a man who had suffered so much. How cruel life was to have taken this man just as he was turning his life around. His first supporter, Dr. Jim McGregor, was also there, and he said, Stuart was gifted and highly intelligent, but his whole life seemed blighted. The biggest tragedy was that he died just as he was beginning to look forward and to plan his life. Also at the funeral was John McManus, who said that Stuart had been the victim of one of Scotland's most shameful miscarriages of justice, that he'd been suffering from severe post-traumatic stress, and it was likely the stress of being wrongfully put in prison that had killed him. Paddy Hill was there too, and he shed a tear at Stuart's cremation as he quietly said goodbye. But the story doesn't end there. There is one final twist that was only discovered after Stuart's death. About a year before Stuart's life was turned upside down when he was arrested for Peter Smith's murder, he had been in a brief relationship with an 18-year-old girl who said that she had been mad about him and that Stuart was quite a charmer, but that he had also been a bit off the rails back then and was into drugs. The romance was short-lived and the pair split up. However, Stuart's girlfriend was pregnant with Stuart's child, eventually giving birth to a baby girl. While Stuart had known about his daughter, and while yes, he had been a bit off the rails at that time, he had no opportunity to get to know his daughter or sort his life out, as before his daughter was 1 year old, he had been arrested for Peter Smith's murder. Following Stuart being sentenced for the murder of Peter Smith, he wrote to his baby's mother and begged her to bring his daughter into the prison so he could see her. Stuart's ex-girlfriend said in an article in the Daily Record newspaper on the 27th of November 2007 that when she took her wee girl into the prison to see her dad, she said that Stuart's face lit up. He was so happy to meet her. However, she goes on to say that she only took their daughter into prison to see him 3 or 4 times before saying to Stuart that she wouldn't be visiting again and would be stopping all contact. It wasn't fair on their daughter to grow up visiting her dad in prison. Stuart was devastated, but he respected the decision and loved his daughter enough to let her go, although he always kept a picture of his daughter in his wallet until the day he died. Stuart's ex-girlfriend went on to marry a man who brought Stuart's baby girl up as his own. When Stuart was released from prison on bail in 2000, he made contact with his ex-girlfriend, desperate to be involved in his daughter's life. However, Stuart's daughter had never been told that Stuart was her biological dad and had grown up believing another man was her dad, and her mother made the decision that it was best that this continued for now. It wouldn't be until after Stuart's death that his daughter finally found out that her biological dad had been Stuart Gair. Stuart's ex-girlfriend went on to say that she feels terrible that Stuart didn't get to know his daughter and that it had a huge impact on his and his daughter's life. She said that it was tragic that Stuart was wrongly imprisoned and that the justice system had let him down. When she found out that he'd been arrested for murder, she was shocked. She never thought him capable of that. In 2007, Stuart Gair's daughter was 19 and pregnant herself, and it was announced not long after Stuart's death that his daughter would inherit his compensation money. Stuart's daughter's mother said that at the moment her daughter was in shock about everything, but that the money would secure her daughter and granddaughter's future. Now, I don't want to leave Stuart's story at such a sad place, so I've spoken to someone that knew Stuart really well to end the story. Kathy from the Miscarriage of Justice organisation knew Stuart and even allowed him to sleep on her sofa when he was first released from prison. Here's what she had to say.
Oh, he was my first client. Stuart was he was the first person that I ever worked with was Stuart. And he was an absolutely amazing person who would have been a huge success had he not died, had he not had the heart attack. He was making so much progress, and I just, I'm fond of them all, but Stuart I was really fond of. I organised all his funeral, everything, because there was nobody else to do it. So I did it, and it was one of the hardest things that I had to do. And Stuart had never been abroad, so here you go, this is how nuts I am. Stuart had never been abroad. He was honestly within a week of getting his compensation, and that's what he was wanting to travel, he was wanting to do things, he was wanting to see the world. So he'd never done it. So Stuart's ashes came to the organisation. They were under my desk for 7 years. I used to take them home on holiday weekends. I wouldn't leave him alone, even although it was his ashes. I know it's stupid, but I'd take him home and put him on my bedroom chest of drawers. See, when I was getting undressed and stuff, I'd put a towel over it. But such was the relationship that I had with Stuart, you know, and as I said, that level of professionalism, I was still keeping that up with the ashes. You can't see me in a state of undress. No, it's not going to happen. But as I say, Stuart how I've never been stopped at customs and arrested, I don't know. I used to take a matchbox of Stuart's ashes when I was going abroad, and I scattered them. So Stuart, who had never been abroad, is now in Mexico, Italy, Spain, Canada, America. He is very well travelled. A matchbox, I even got him into Australia. So there you go. Stuart, who had never done that, has travelled the world. His ashes are scattered all over the place because, well, he was a beautiful person, you know, and he deserved it, you know, and we finally had a wee service and scat, because we just couldn't think where to put, you know, where are we going to put him? You know, somebody says put him in the Clyde, but he didn't have good memories there. He used to sleep under those bridges, you know, so I was to put him in there, and so he's now, you know, he's in the Scottish Highlands and he's travelled the world in matchboxes, and that's what I did, yeah.